Have you ever heard the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? Basically, what this means is that when you look at the individual parts of something, you expect one thing, but you get more than the parts added together. We see this in a lot of places. Take this picture, for example. What shape do you see? Technically, the only shape here is a circle, or 4 circles to be precise. But if that is all we see, we miss the bigger picture. Most likely, your brain filled in the connections between the dots with imaginary lines to make a square. Also, Belgian draft horses, they're really strong. One of them can pull up to 8,000 pounds. So how much would you expect 2 to be able to pull? Maybe 16,000, 18,000, 20,000? Well, two Belgian draft horses can together pull up to 24,000 pounds. That's 2 horses working together doing the same work as 3 working individually. We do this with music too. One of the best modern examples is the Broadway musical Hamilton in the song The World Is Not Enough. There is a count to 10 which reminds viewers of all the duels fought throughout the show, and that's soon followed by a bunch of short phrases all together like satisfied, throw away my shot, rise up, teach me how to say goodbye, Eliza, and raise a glass to freedom. Now all these little musical callbacks work together to carry this emotional load and communicate a huge message in just a few words, and better than really a lot of words could have done. But whether it's music or horses or just a bunch of dots, these examples show us how something very simple can carry a much heavier load than just the sum of the parts. And that kind of thing is all over the place in the Bible. So back in John 4, when we're talking about Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, she asks him this seemingly random question about mountains, and he replies that true worshipers of God will worship in spirit and truth. And sometimes we breeze right over that, but Jesus has just dropped a bomb in the middle of this casual conversation. So rewind back to the book of Exodus. The people of Israel are booking out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea, and they start the longest camping trip ever in the middle of the Sinai Desert. And during the 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, they do something super important. They make the tabernacle, and the altar, and some lampposts, and a table for holy bread, and the Ark of the Covenant, which is like God's throne on earth to the Jewish people. At that point, once they get all this stuff together, they get the priests of God to dedicate the tabernacle to God. And do you know what happens? God shows up. The presence of God shows up and settles over the tabernacle like a thick cloud. So even though we understand that God is everywhere, the Jews had this big tent, the tabernacle, which was the physical place where God was. It was his dwelling place, the place where God stayed. Now fast forward a little bit to 1 Kings. We find Solomon, David's son, the super rich, super wise king of Israel. And he has his 700 wives and 300 concubines. But before he decided he was going to collect women like their Pokemon cards, he decided to do something super important. He was going to build the temple of God in Jerusalem. And this is a huge undertaking, just a massive temple and huge altar and these great big lampstands and all this other stuff. And when the priests come together to dedicate the temple, do you know what happens? God's glory shows up again. Now, what about Samaria? Samaria was the name of the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel after the north and south split, and the two kingdoms were going to go their separate ways. Jerusalem was out in Judah in the south, and Samaria was in Israel in the north. And I'm sure you remember that Israel had terrible idol-worshiping kings, and they eventually got smashed by Assyria. So after Assyria took over, they deported a whole bunch of Israelites and transplanted a whole bunch of Assyrians there to Samaria, and they intermarried with the local population, and they had kids with these people, and those people became the Samaritans. Now, this created a blended culture. Most importantly for our story, it created this ethnic minority with different religious practices, specifically that they worshiped God in their own temple in Mount Gerizim. Now, both Samaria and Jerusalem were centers of a political presence in their time, but by Jesus' time, they had both become centers of a divine presence, at least to the people who were worshiping there. So now we get back to John 4. The Samaritan woman is asking about where to worship God. Basically, she wants to know where God is located. Now think about this. She's asking Jesus, which temple is God in? And he answers, neither. Now, if we look back to verse 23, Jesus says to her, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. But then the woman responds about the Messiah, which seems a little random at first, but it isn't. The Messiah means anointed one, someone who has been chosen by God for a special role, and that typically meant priests and kings. She seems to assume the Messiah will somehow be connected with worship because the Messiah is going to have all the answers. And if you flip back to the beginning of John's gospel, there's this incredible prologue talking about Jesus, that he is the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he says later on that the Word put on flesh, meaning that the Word, or God, put on a body. Then the Word dwelt among people. But dwelt doesn't quite catch the full meaning here. Dwelt here literally means tabernacled. So God put on a body and tabernacled with the people, just like in Exodus. So then what happens? John says that we saw his glory. Now, this is the same kind of language of when God shows up in the temple or in the tabernacle and fills it with his holy presence. When Jesus says that God isn't in either temple, what he is saying is that he is the presence of God. It's like his body is the temple. Jesus said that the hour is coming. So to find out what spirit and truth means here, we need to look later in the book of John. If we look over at John chapter 14, starting in verse 16, just before this, we see Jesus, and he's talking to his apostles, and he says the Father, that he's going back to the Father, but he doesn't want to leave the apostles alone. And he's telling them that I'm not going to leave you. And he says that I'm going to ask the Father, and he's going to give you another helper who's going to be with you forever. And he goes on to name this helper the Spirit of Truth. Later in chapter 16, he says that when the Spirit of Truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. So the Spirit, or the Holy Spirit, has been given to the people of God to guide them into truth. So what does worshiping in spirit and truth mean? First, it doesn't mean two things. Spirit and truth are joined together to communicate a single idea about worship. It's kind of like if you ask about the weather in Alabama and somebody might say it's hot and humid. It's one thing, the weather, that is mutually described by two ideas. In this case, worship is mutually described by two things tied together, spirit and truth. So the second part is that spirit, I believe, is referring here to the Holy Spirit. And truth is referring to God's truth, which the Spirit reveals. So what is God's truth? Well, in God's own words about Jesus, he says, "This is my beloved Son. I am well pleased with him." God's truth is that Jesus is his Son. And if Jesus is God's Son, then Jesus is God. And if Jesus is God, then he deserves worship. third. I can't say it better than John. And so in his first letter, in 1 John, starting in chapter 3, verse 23, he says, "And this is God's commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he has commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in him, and God in him. And by this we know that he abides or lives in us, by the Spirit whom he has given us. By this you will know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God." Whew. So that's a lot. And the truth is that's only the beginning. But it is so vital that we worship in spirit and truth. After all, those who worship in spirit and truth are the ones that God is looking for. So when we worship in spirit and truth, it means that there is this confession that through the Spirit that Jesus Christ is, the holy Son of God who came in the flesh, and that it's through his death, burial, and resurrection that we have been given access to the Father. Jesus then is not just the one being worshipped, but he is the one we worship God through. This is big stuff. And we have these two small words, and they carry so much weight and such deep meaning because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.